I'd like to ask you, dear audience, the question is, what do you believe, what do you think is the most important thing we need for improving digital services across the board? Is it more money? Is it more political will? More consultation and engagement? More technology and knowledge sharing? Or is it something else we're not identifying? Whilst you are voting away on that question, let me introduce our guests. A great big welcome to Mike Bevan. Mike is the Senior Manager in the Digital Government Transformation Public Sector team of Amazon Web Services. Mike, great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Big welcome to you, Sir Anir Chowdhury, who is a policy advisor on all digital matters for the government of Bangladesh. Anir, it's wonderful for you joining us today. Good afternoon, good evening to you.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Great to be here.
And please welcome onto screen Delfina Suarez, Head of the Operating Unit on Policy-Driven Electronic Governance for the UN University over in Portugal. Thank you so much for joining us, Delfina.
Thank you so much. Allow me just to say that it is a pleasure to be here and to greet all of the colleagues in the panel, as well as all the audience.
Let's get to it, shall we? Let's see the poll results. Thank you so much for voting. What do you think is the most important thing we need for improving digital services across the board? Let's drum roll on the results. Really quite ahead, panelists, just so you know, 44%, a few votes coming in now, more political will, which ties in with our discussion nicely. Second to that, and crawling up the numbers, is more technology and knowledge sharing. Thirdly, more consultation and engagement. Interestingly, down towards the bottom was more money. So that's quite an interesting poll to be cracking on with. Amir, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask you first if you could share some examples of what Bangladesh is doing to improve local and national digital governance, and two questions in one. Can you share some of also the major challenges that you have in this work?
Sure. Thank you, Sammy. Bangladesh had been on a very aggressive digital journey since the end of 2008. When our Prime Minister made a clarion call to build a digital Bangladesh, even in an impoverished country at that time. By 2021, which was the 50th anniversary of our country's birth. So very strong political will demonstrated. And as you pointed out, political will came up number one. And that was demonstrated in the work that we have done in the last 14 or 15 years. And that really paid dividends during COVID time period. We set up what are called digital centers, which are physical locations, about 9,000 across the entire country, half of them in government offices, but all run by entrepreneurs who sell services. So we started with birth registration being sold digitally. And then now we have over 300 different types of services from these centers. Every month, about 5 to 6 million people go to these centers to access digital services. So analog citizens accessing digital services. That's how we actually tried to bridge digital divide. And we saw in the last decade or so, we did a poll in December 2021, we saved citizens about 12 billion work days, about $16 billion, and about 7+ billion visits were eliminated. So this is how we measure the efficiency of how we are delivering benefits to citizens through TCV, time, costs, and visits. During COVID, we actually saw about 18 million decisions being taken electronically, even though all offices were closed for months and months. We saw social safety nets, garment workers' payments all done digitally. We saw merchant payments using mobile wallet go up about 15 times, so 1,500% increase. And judiciary, which was the last bastion to fall in terms of digital adoption, was also made digital because we had overcrowding in prisons because no bail hearing was taking place. So we reduced overcrowding in prisons by 11% within 2 months using virtual bail hearing. So these were all things that happened during COVID because of the infrastructure, because of the mechanisms, both digital and physical, that we had put in place. We also saw use of cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence being used quite predominantly during COVID for healthcare service delivery, for tracking the disease, because we had only one PCR lab in the country of 165 million people in the beginning. So we used technology to actually track the disease by having people call into our national helpline and using that data and analyzing using artificial intelligence. We saw huge growth of data dashboards in almost all departments. I think data, as we call it, the new oil, I think was really well understood by the policymakers during COVID. You also talked about challenges that we faced, and we saw two big challenges. Education was a big challenge. Even though we resorted to internet, we saw that most of our primary schoolers and high schoolers did not have access to internet in a meaningful way. So they may have access, but it was not reliable. It was not fast enough to actually see high quality videos during that time. So we resorted to repurposing our Parliament TV as education TV, and that broadened access. But still, we were not able to reach most of our students in a meaningful way. We also saw, I think a lot of our previous panelists talked about leaving no one behind. Even though we repurposed our national helpline 333 as the largest telemedicine service in the country, we saw over 7 million calls coming in to serve people for telemedicine. We saw 10 million calls for emergency food support. But still, we saw people not being able to use technology in an effective way. So this is one challenge that we have taken on. We are working on a report called Equality Through E-Quality, which is looking at very specifically group by group, individual by individual, business by business, especially focusing on the small businesses, to see what would make them bring into the digital lifestyle and what could actually enhance their productivity, enhance their lifestyles using the digital. So the digital adoption has to be really seen through the eyes of the beneficiary, eyes of the consumer.
It's interesting that you're actually saying you're listening and building trust with the people, and that's, as you said, leading to that top of the tree political will.
We see that a lot of expansion has happened for digital, a lot of adoption, but not enough inclusion. So there is a big difference now. We see, I think COVID really put it to, I think broadened our perspective and deepened our perspective, actually. That is not expansion that will help us, but inclusion. Thank you.
And it's probably highlighted that in a shorter space of time. So, Anir, thank you so much for sharing. So I'd like to ask you all this question, starting with you, Delphina, as you mentioned, with this different levels of administration, it's very difficult to collaborate. You know, how can national and local levels of government work together better?
Sammy, thank you. Very important question. I'll try to be not abstract, but concrete. With 3 C's, coordination, capacity development, and citizens engagement. Now, they may sound like cliches, but let me go a little deeper. In terms of coordination, we felt that even though when we started about 15 years ago, we started with international consultants and development organizations developing digital strategy for us. And let me tell you that it did not work, because they were cut and paste from many developed countries and cut and paste from countries, even developing countries who have done well. But the context is very different. Every country has a very specific context. So you really have to develop a team which is politically, I think, empowered and bureaucratically embedded within the system. And that's what we had to do. We had to develop the team that I formed called A2I. It used to be called Access to Information. Now it's called Aspire to Innovate, soon to become the National Innovation Agency in the government. Started with the Prime Minister's office. Now it's embedded in Cabinet and ICT Ministry. So it's actually able to bring in the coordination across the board within the government. Also important is coordinating with the private sector. And we saw the possibilities, that the realm of possibilities during COVID for the first time. We talked about all sorts of coordination with private sector, which were not realized. But COVID made it so. And now that COVID is sort of going away, some of that possibilities I don't see happening anymore. But we saw the boundaries. Mike talked about how Amazon actually helped. During COVID, everybody helped. All NGOs in the country, all private sector actually helped quite a bit. So that's another coordination. That's one. Second is capacity within the government, including local government. So we introduced many different methodologies called service process simplification. And that's the mantra is simplify before digitization. So that was very, very helpful. We introduced something called Digital Service Design Lab. So series of these labs that were done over weeks to redesign a service from the perspective of citizens. We introduced something called empathy training, which is a design thinking that we trained about 35,000 civil servants on. So all these different things that actually came together, the technology frameworks, interoperability, they actually were driven through bureaucracy, not through technology companies. The third is citizens' engagement. And this is where I think really looking through the eyes of the citizen, listening to them. I think the previous panel actually harped on that quite a bit. We see three things that needs to happen there with citizens' engagement. One is that digital inequality has to be seen through the eyes of individuals, persons with disabilities, women, elderly, indigenous population. And we have to understand that just making digital resources available to them is not enough. You have to work with them and see that they are making the best use of this digital resource and design them in their way. Second is we have to think very holistically. And there is something that we're looking at now that we have never done before is the issue of power asymmetry and information asymmetry within society. So the power structure within the socioeconomic realm of a society really defines how digitization is used and vice versa. And digitization also affects the power asymmetry within society. And the third thing that we're looking at is something that we have seen in Professor Amartya Sen's literature. It's called adverse digital incorporation. Some digitization is actually harmful. So we can't say that all digitization leads to great benefits for everybody. So we really need to be very nuanced in our design, in our implementation, in our engagement with citizens. And that's where we need to look at what digitization harms and what digitization helps and make that distinction and not do the ones that are harming right now. Thank you.
We've had a question upvoted. In poor countries, in poorer countries, the majority of people are and can still be illiterate. The infrastructure is non-existent. Do you think it's too early to talk about digitalization in those regions? Who would like to? It's a big question there.
As Delphina said, I think it's really about context. When we started in Bangladesh, we had less than 1% internet penetration. And we said that we'll become a digital country. So what that meant is that we needed to set up centers in local government offices, all rural local government offices, 4,500 of them. We set up centers where people would come, pay a small fee, and access digital services through the entrepreneurs. They won't access them directly. So this we call indirect digital literacy. So they're not digital literate directly. So if we actually say, what is the digital literacy of Bangladesh? We will say, even now, 45% smartphone penetration, 65% internet penetration. It doesn't work all the time. We have internet, but doesn't work all the time. But people are accessing digital services through these 4,500 centers in local government offices and another 4,500 in private sector. So there is this very deep private-public partnership that has really happened. So we need to look at that through that. These centers were all closed during COVID. So what do? Then we repurposed our national helpline so that people could call into that helpline using feature phones, 333, and can ask for telemedicine service, can ask for emergency food support, can ask for land records through that. So new things came up. Again, use old technology, use physical as a blend with digital. So we can't say that it has to be like Estonia or like UK or like US. And everybody will actually operate digital services on the web using their smart devices. That's not going to happen, but we can make it contextual and design it right.
Back to your 3 C's. Thank you, Anir. I want to ask this is a very big question with not a huge amount of time left, but it has been voted up. And this is the core of everything we're talking about. How can we adapt the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals with digital services in the context of the global south. What one thing would you highlight from your experience that can be done to help developing countries? And again, we can highlight the global south, but let's be a little broader as well, to overcome their special challenges and achieve this SDGs within this context.
Sure. I think South-South cooperation is going to be key, because Southern countries understand problems of other Southern countries. And we formed this South-South Network for Public Service Innovation about 5 years ago with the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. Now it has about 30 countries of members and about 13 international organizations of 43 members. And they're working really well in terms of sharing best practices and helping each other out. But I'll add a 1.B, Sami, if you allow, and that's public-private partnership as well. I think private sector has so much knowledge, experience, and data that we saw being really put to good use during COVID. If we can keep that ethos going forward, that will also really help. Thank you.
It was worth having the 1B. Thank you, Anir. Great closing words.